Welcome, everybody. This is Serge Dedina, the mayor of Imperial Beach. It is Tuesday, August 11th, and welcome to the Hate Crimes Virtual Town Hall, hosted in partnership by the City of Imperial Beach and the San Diego County District Attorney's Office. I just want to really acknowledge and thank District Attorney Summer Steffen and Deputy District Attorney Leonard Tren for all their support for hosting this, but more importantly, their support for prosecuting hate crimes, and then more importantly, communicating to the broader San Diego community, many communities, why it's important to prosecute hate crimes, why it's important to investigate these hate crimes, but more importantly, why it's important for us not to tolerate hate, racism, and any outward display of anything that makes people feel harassed, uncomfortable, and not feel welcome in our great melting pot in San Diego, but more importantly, in the United States. As a first-generation American and the son of someone who came to America escaping hate crimes in Europe, is something I feel very passionately about. But more importantly, as someone who witnessed a hate crime vividly, a shooting in Imperial Beach when I was 15 or 16 in 1980, it's something that I've been cognizant of, and more importantly, really committed to addressing to make sure that everyone feels welcome in Imperial Beach. Everyone feels that they're able to walk and be free in our city. And so when things like hate crimes happen, it's really important to make sure they're investigated and prosecuted. And as the son of a former public defender, as well as Judge Pro Tem in San Diego, I fully have so much faith and respect in our criminal justice system. More importantly, our system that acknowledges that we need to hold people accountable for violating the law. We need to have investigations that are fair, but more importantly, we have to have prosecutions that are fair, impartial, but more importantly, hold people accountable to the law. And so that's where we're at in San Diego. And that's why we're holding this, to discuss all these issues and why it's so important. With that, it's my pleasure to introduce District Attorney Summer Steffen, who's been a big champion of Imperial Beach, but a really big champion throughout San Diego County. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Mayor Dedina, for that perfect introduction. And like I've said publicly and continue to say, I think that where it comes to hate crimes, hate and prejudice, leaders have to be very clear and speak clearly about it and not be fuzzy about where we stand. And you have certainly done that with your leadership. I know that you personally got involved when you were concerned about a potential hate crime incident, and it is much appreciated. It's great to join this town hall with the City of Imperial Beach and with Mayor Dedina and the city and the City Council, along with our hate crimes team leader, Leonard Tren, who you will hear from shortly. I'm Summer Steffen. I'm San Diego County's District Attorney, and it is an honor to serve justice and to pursue a fair and equal justice for all. We do that throughout San Diego County, all 18 cities and the unincorporated areas. And our goal and focus is public safety that is balanced, that's measured, that has prevention, that has protection of victims, and has ethical prosecution. But where it comes to hate crimes, we have been very clear. We dedicated resources to hate crimes, and some people ask, why is that? Why is that a passion? Why is that really important for public safety in San Diego County? And I think the way that I personally feel about it, coming from an Armenian upbringing, my family experiencing the Armenian genocide, and realizing what happens when there is a hate and a loss of civil rights just simply based on who people are, not just judging, stereotyping, hating. It's really important to me personally. And so we've really focused on it. But I think one of the reasons is hate crimes, the way I think about it, it is while it may be targeting a certain victim, one or two people or more in specific, it is really group hate, group bias. So everything that the crime brings in terms of trauma and shame and injury and everything as to one person actually is felt by everyone that shares the characteristics of the group that is protected. And this causes a ripple effect, and a ripple effect that is felt by everyone is felt by children walking by hateful signs of whether it's KKK, swastika, or any other hateful sign, and kind of infecting their atmosphere, making them feel unsafe just by the presence of these hateful symbols, or whether it's because they know that their neighbor, their friend, somebody they know was injured, and it makes them personally feel vulnerable. So Leonard Tren is going to go through more details, but hate crimes are a category of crimes that can happen, anything from assault, vandalism, all the way up to murder, that occur because of because part of the motivation or the entire motivation is a bias against a certain protected group. And that would be a hate crime that's motivated by bias against a race, ethnicity, gender, a sexual orientation, religion, or disability. Those are the protected categories. But unfortunately, still today, the number one category that is here in San Diego, across the state and across the country, the number one target still of the highest level of hate crimes is an African American male. That category of race is the one that we find the highest statistics. Second highest statistics is based in religion. For the most percentage of that is someone who has comes from a Jewish religion. And the third, and sometimes it falls in the second place, is someone who is an LGBT or identifies as LGBT. So that's second and third place. San Diego County's District Attorney, my office, has a specialized hate crimes division led by Leonard Tren. But that unit also includes investigators. It includes victim advocates that are trauma informed, that help victims in this area. But law enforcement, sheriff's department, police departments, they all work in coalitions, the Hate Crimes Coalition and others. So we work together to stamp out these hateful incidents. There is a difference, and it's a little bit confusing to our public when we refer to things as hate incidents as opposed to hate crimes. And that's important because hate crimes are things that we can charge criminally. We can bring accountability through criminal charges. And I'm not going to talk about a specific case because it's pending, but like the recent case in Imperial Beach that was charged as a hate crime. There are other things that are very hurtful and traumatize our communities, but they don't fall as a crime. They are hate incidents that, standing alone without some other evidence, are not subject to prosecution, but are something that we really care about. Those are like people recently that wore a mask that includes hateful language symbols like the KKK or a swastika. Those types of things are incidents that we still want to know about because they help us to build a case. They give us that motivation. And that's why recently, talking with our communities, they wanted us to have a way to communicate with us these things where they're not sure that they should call 911, that it's a crime, but they want to report a hate incident. And that's why we created an online at San Diego DA, sdcda.org. We created a template where people can fill out a form and online reporting, or they can call our hotline. And that is managed every single day. We have already received 30 tips on that that online base or call, which we've been able to respond to each one of these. Some of them may not amount to a hate crime, but they can come together to give us the underlying basis. I'll give you an example. Recently, a woman had called about someone taunting her online about her biracial children. Well, she didn't know what to do with that. Is that First Amendment speech? Does it translate into hate crime? But she reported it anyhow. And when it was reported, the FBI was able to investigate that case that they took seriously, and they discovered that that person had gone beyond words and had actually prepared to target a school that had a high diversity ratio. So a terrible crime was stopped by that simple report where the person didn't know whether this was really a crime or an incident. I want to make sure, just for you to know out there, that we are available and ready to help you, that we've tripled our prosecutions of hate crimes because we want to send a very clear message that we're not going to tolerate that. We're not going to let that seed grow in our community. We know when there is economic stress, that is a time that we see people looking for someone to blame, like our Asian communities. We're experiencing a heightened level of hate crimes. We've charged 2 cases involving our Asian community at this time because of COVID-related animus towards folks of an Asian race or ethnicity. And so this is why we want you to reach out to us, and whatever we can do to help, whether it's to support you through victim services or to bring a prosecution, you will get a response from us. And I know that law enforcement is united in supporting the accountability for hate crimes. I want to introduce, one of the things that is one of the best parts of the job of being DA, other than just serving all of you, is being able to have such an amazing, dedicated team. Leonard Tren is an experienced prosecutor who has prosecuted child molest, all sorts of horrific crimes, hate crimes, homicide cases. He is a premier prosecutor, but on top of it, he has a knack for having the courage and the graciousness to connect with every community and open doors for the trust to build with every community. And he is the team leader and leader of our hate crimes division. Leonard Tren is with us, and I think he's going to give you a class. You're going to become experts on hate crimes. You can help your neighbors and your neighborhood. Mayor, if it's okay, we can go to Leonard Tren at this time.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for that introduction, DA Stefan, and we look forward to having Leonard speak as well. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Summer, for the kind words, and thank you, Mayor, for inviting us to speak to your community. I became the hate crimes prosecutor almost 3 years ago, and one of the very first calls I had was from the mayor regarding hate incidents that were occurring within Imperial Beach, and I can tell you that he is one of the fiercest opponents of hate and bias that I've encountered in my stint as the hate crimes prosecutor. For the residents of Imperial Beach, the Sheriff's Department, the detectives that are assigned there are top-notch when it comes to investigating hate crimes. So I do want to thank the mayor and the Sheriff's Department for all the work that they do in trying to combat hate. So I'm going to spend a few minutes talking a little bit about hate crimes laws in California. We're fortunate to have some of the strongest hate crimes laws in the country. Summer talked a little bit about what makes something a hate crime. And in California, a hate crime is defined as a crime that's committed in whole or in part because of a bias against one or more of the following actual or perceived characteristics belonging to the victim. And that can either be race, ethnicity, or nationality. And as Summer mentioned, that is the #1 category, and it has been the #1 category for hate crime targets within the last 25, 30 years. Religion, sexual orientation, gender or gender identity, disability, and that can include physical disability, mental disability, a permanent disability, or even a temporary disability, or the association with any of the above. And there are a lot of kind of moving parts to California's hate crimes laws, and so I want to talk about them one by one. The first is in whole or in part. What that basically means is that there can be a whole bunch of reasons why someone commits a crime. For instance, if someone grabs a purse from a woman walking down the street, oftentimes the motivation is greed. They want what's in that woman's purse. It's not there, so they take it. But if they happen to target that person because of one of these categories, let's say they have a history of targeting people walking out of a Jewish synagogue, for instance, or they keep repeatedly picking on someone because of their race, then it starts to potentially fit into the hate crime category. And the motivation, one of the motivations might be greed, or it might be anger, or whatever it might end up being. But as long as the bias part is one of those reasons why the crime was committed against that particular victim, we're allowed to prosecute it under California's hate crimes laws. The second thing I want to touch on is bias. It's not enough that you just happen to pick victims who are of the same religion or are of the same race. There has to be evidence of bias. And I can give you an example from one of the cases that I had from a long time ago to kind of flesh that out. There was a woman who worked at the Ark, and a lot of the people, her coworkers who worked there, had mental disabilities. And she one day decided that she was going to steal from them because they had mental disabilities, and it was easier for her to get away with the crime. So she picked on two and repeatedly stole from them over and over and over again. Well, that wouldn't necessarily fit under California's hate crimes laws because there wasn't any evidence that she was biased against them. She just happened to pick them because she thought she could get away with it. And so that bias has to be present. There has to be some evidence of that bias in order for us to make it fit as a hate crime. The third thing I want to touch on is actual or perceived characteristics. The offender, the person who's committing the crime, can get your characteristic wrong. So for instance, if someone looks at me and they think that I'm of Chinese descent, I'm not, but they blame me for bringing coronavirus and COVID and causing this whole pandemic, and they start saying racial slurs that are Chinese against me, they're not protected from the hate crimes laws because they're wrong about my ethnicity or my nationality. It still is a hate crime under the law, so you can be wrong about someone's characteristic and you're still going to be protected by California's hate crimes laws. The final thing I want to talk about is association with any of the above. And essentially what that means is if you do advocacy for or you participate in activities that are centered around either religion or race or sexual orientation, and you get targeted because of that association, you fall under California's hate crimes laws, and we can file that as a hate crime if you're targeted because of that association. So the kind of classic example that I use when I speak to people in the public is every year, at least before this year, there was the Pride Parade in Hillcrest, one of the premier events. It's, I think, one of the largest Pride events in the country. And a lot of allies come to participate in the Pride Parade. If those allies who are not part of the LGBT community get targeted because they are participating in the Pride Parade, they are protected under California's hate crimes laws. And so that's what the association with any of the above means. So once we kind of see a crime that fits those characteristics, the next thing that I do when I get a police report or am reviewing a case is I think to myself, how do I prove the bias? How do I show a jury potentially that this is a bias-motivated crime? And there's a whole bunch of things that I draw on in order to prove that something is bias-related. So one of the key pieces of evidence that I look at is statements that the defendant makes before, during, and after the crime. I think it's important to kind of analyze the statements that a defendant makes as before, during, or after, because if it's a one-off, if they happen to use one slur while they're committing a crime, and let's say the crime is assault, and they drop a racial slur as they're beating the victim up, could that be explained because they're just trying to insult the victim? Sure, that is one plausible explanation. But the more often someone repeats a slur during the assault, the less likely, to me, it would seem to indicate that it is meant to insult the victim and more evidence of bias. If they happen to say it before they start committing the crime, I also look at that as well, because if it's continuing on throughout the course of the crime, that tends to me to show that that is a bias-motivated crime as opposed to just a one-off or trying to insult the victim. And of course, after the crime, let's say the victim is able to call law enforcement, or an independent witness is able to call law enforcement, and they arrive and they contact the suspect. Fortunately, now lots of law enforcement agencies have body-worn cameras, and they roll those cameras as they're interviewing witnesses. And I've seen it in case after case after case where the suspect is still using those racial slurs or their homophobic slurs as they're talking to law enforcement. So that's still also good evidence that I have and can use to prove the bias. What else can I look at? Complete absence of any other motivation for the crime. A lot of hate crimes are stranger on stranger. The victim and the defendant happen to be in the same place at the same time. And because of that bias motivation, it causes the defendant to act out and commit a crime against the victim. If there doesn't appear to be any other prior history between the victim and the defendant, or any other explanation for why the defendant would assault the victim, that tends to me to show that it may be potentially bias motivated. So the complete absence of any other motivation is something that I also look at. Prior contacts with law enforcement demonstrating bias. There was one of the first cases that I had involved a physician, and he was using racial slurs as he was assaulting the victim. And when we came in to negotiate the case, his attorney was telling me he's a doctor and he's not biased at all. Like, why would a doctor be biased? And it's pretty convincing, you know, on its face to look at a doctor and say, you know, maybe we need to take a closer look at this case. So I pulled all of his prior cases, and they weren't all bad cases. Some of them were, you know, complaints about being too loud in the evening hours. Some of them were drunk in public type of calls. But as I looked through each of these prior reports, I saw that in every single prior report, he used some sort of racial slur or homophobic slur against the officers or the other witnesses who were around when law enforcement arrived. And so I collected all those reports and I provided them to the defense, and it sort of undercut their argument that this guy was not a biased individual. And it just so happened that he had previously made comments against the same race. And so that really, really undercut his argument that he didn't have a bias. So prior contacts with law enforcement or prior convictions, if they do have any that demonstrate bias, those are oftentimes helpful. In today's day and age, social media is a huge goldmine for finding out what someone's all about. It can be comments that they post on other people's Facebook pages, comments they post on their own. It can be images that they post, but social media right now, if you have a public profile, everyone knows your stuff. And fortunately for us and for investigators and detectives, we can look at that stuff and see if if there is evidence of a history of bias in your past that we can use to help bolster our case. And finally, Summer touched on this as well, tattoos, clothing, and other hate symbols. They can be good evidence as well. The swastika, the KKK hood, those are kind of the classic hate symbols that are really easy to distill and demonstrate the bias, but there are a whole bunch of uncommon ones as well. If you're interested in seeing some hate symbols, the Anti-Defamation League has a whole database of hate symbols and what they mean. And you can access their website and see kind of what the hate symbols are. When I first started, it was kind of shocking to me how many different hate symbols there were out there. I didn't know about a lot of them, but the ones that we've mentioned already, those are kind of the classic ones. Okay, so now we're done talking about how we prove the bias. I want to talk a little bit about First Amendment free speech, which Summer also touched on. The First Amendment says Congress shall make no laws abridging the freedom of speech, and that applies to the states through the 14th Amendment. And so what that basically means in English is that, generally speaking, speech alone is not a crime. There are exceptions to that, of course. Within the hate crimes arena, speech can be a crime if it threatens violence against a person or a group of people, and that person has the apparent ability to carry out the threat. So how this usually plays out is someone either threatens to cause harm to another person, and they're in person, or it could be even over electronic means. It's a pretty low threshold for establishing that it's outside the First Amendment protections, but that's kind of the threshold. When we have speech that doesn't threaten violence against a person, or the person doesn't have the apparent ability to carry out the threat, that's sometimes where we fall into the hate incidents. And so kind of the classic examples is if someone just starts using racial slurs or homophobic slurs against someone else, anti-Semitic slurs, that's technically protected speech. You're allowed to be racist, and you're allowed to be homophobic, and you're allowed to be anti-Semitic. We don't like it. We definitely want to call people out on that behavior, but we can't criminalize it, meaning we can't prosecute someone for using hate speech. But if they do threaten that violence and they have the apparent ability, that's where it crosses the line, and that's where we can prosecute. So why is it still important to report hate incidents, and specifically hate crimes? The reason why reporting hate incidents is so important to me as the hate crimes prosecutor, and to the mayor and to law enforcement, is that hate incidents usually are precursors to hate crimes. There's a whole host of reasons why that's the case. When someone starts hearing hate speech, for instance, and they're not called out on it, it becomes normalized. And so it becomes easier for that person to continue to use hate speech over and over and over again. And when they are eventually called out by someone, that's when the violence occurs. That's when the hate crimes actually occur. And so if we don't report it and we don't respond in an appropriate manner and we let it run unchecked, it just encourages more and more of that behavior. Hate incidents are precursors to hate crimes, so we want to really address it when it is just a hate incident before it becomes a hate crime. Reporting hate incidents can prove identity. It's not hard to imagine an incident. Let's say you're at a grocery store parking lot and you're walking out and someone in the parking lot starts chastising you because of your race. And you see that person getting out of his car and it's a blue Toyota and you get a partial license plate, but they don't threaten you. They don't say anything threatening to you. And so you just kind of walk away. The next person who has the same race as you walks out of the same grocery store and into the same parking lot. And that same person then comes to them and they start saying the same thing. And maybe nothing happens there. There's no threats, there's no violence. And so that person walked away. But the third person that comes out of that grocery store with the same race as the first two people, they aren't so lucky. And when that perpetrator starts using slurs against them, they stand up for themselves and they say, hey, it's not cool to say that. And then all of a sudden it erupts into violence. If that person gets away and the victim's not able to identify them either because they're hurt badly, they don't see what car the person's getting out of, the first two people do, they report it, that can help prove identity. Identity, like I said, since most hate crimes are stranger on stranger, that's oftentimes one of the best defenses that hate crimes defendants have. And so if those things are reported to law enforcement, it can really help shore up that we have the right person. What else can we use hate incidents and prior hate crimes for? It can help prove the bias motivation. Like the doctor that I talked about earlier, the more incidents that we have that show that that person has engaged in biased behavior, the less likely it is that they're going to be successful in saying that they don't have that bias motivation. And we're allowed to introduce those past bias incidents in court. Finally, one of the most important reasons why it's important to report hate incidents and hate crimes is it can really help reluctant victims. When I meet with people in the Hate Crimes Coalition who work with refugees or people from countries where they have a distrust of government and a distrust of law enforcement because of where they came from. If they come here, they're reluctant to report for those same reasons. They think that our government's the same as where they came from, and so they don't want to report things. If they have someone standing up for them, it helps make it easier for them to report. It's a powerful message that you can send as an ally when you can stand for a victim who can't stand for themselves. And so if you stand there with them and you basically tell them, I saw what happened and that's not okay, it really does help encourage them to have the strength to report their crimes and talk about their victimization. Some of the things that our office does to kind of combat hate crimes, we're heavily involved in training. We have trained law enforcement agencies, we've trained dispatchers, we've trained the public on how to recognize what a hate crime is and where to report it. And that's partly the reasons why we've seen some of the increase the last couple of years in hate crimes. Like Summer mentioned, we created an online reporting tool at SanDiegoDA.com, and we're the first DA's office in San Diego County to have an online reporting tool for hate incidents and hate crimes. We also have an email account, hatecrimes@sdcda.org, and we have a phone number as well that you can report hate crimes and leave a message. No matter how you choose to report, we respond within 24 hours of getting the tip. And finally, we have victim advocates who contact victims of hate crimes and victims of hate incidents as well to find out what needs they have and how we can assist them in overcoming whatever act it was that they were victimized by. I've spoken to hundreds of victims of hate incidents and hate crimes, and like Summer said, its effect on them goes far beyond whatever physical scars or injuries they might have suffered. There's a psychological harm that's done to those victims as well, and it can take them a long time to recover from it. And so our victim advocates are there and ready to help deal with whatever the aftermath is if someone is a victim of a hate incident or a hate crime. So now you're all experts in hate incidents and hate crimes. If you have any questions, you can input them in the chat and we will try to answer them. Unless Summer or the mayor have any comments. You're still muted.
You did a great job as always. So thank you for that. You had, one of the questions I see is from Council Member Spriggs, and it goes along with how you distinguish free speech and talking about, chalk that has hateful images and things. And because chalk can be easily removed, then it's not like a vandalism, like destroying the front of a building. But if it doesn't carry with it the threat, then that makes it more of a hate incident than a hate crime. But what if taking Council Member Spriggs' question and adding to the image that has, let's say, a KKK symbol or something? Let's say an image is added of a threat, like a hateful noose or something. Then we start to really get closer, right, to a hate crime.
Yeah, so there are some symbols when they're accompanied with the intent to intimidate a person. And Summer mentioned a noose. A swastika definitely qualifies, a burning cross. So if any of those are directed at a particular person, then that can actually be prosecuted as a hate crime. It's no longer protected speech because you're directing a threat towards a particular person. The chalk incident, like Summer said, that's the easiest way to classify that crime would be to say it's a vandalism. But since chalk is so easily removed, then it's not really a vandalism, and we then cannot elevate it to a hate crime. Now, the interesting thing is, back up in Northern California, there was a group that was obtained a permit from the city to paint Black Lives Matter on a street. And it was very well done art. It was in big yellow block letters. And two people decided that they wanted to paint over the BLM. And the prosecutors up in that office charged that incident as a hate crime, a misdemeanor vandalism, essentially, for damaging property that was allowed and permitted by the city to be there as a show of support for the movement. So let's see, I'm trying to read some of the other questions. Or drawing depicting law enforcement.
There's a really good question, Leonard, about classes that are specific to hate crimes. I know that our office applies a lot of restorative justice. We've really expanded restorative justice, as you know, for most misdemeanor crimes. We have offered a diversion class that includes cognitive behavioral therapy, and a needs assessment that kind of makes sure that people don't enter the criminal justice system if they don't need to be criminalized, restorative justice and other things. But unlike domestic violence, I don't know if there is a specific class that probation sends people to for hate crimes.
We have sent some hate crime offenders up to the Museum of Tolerance in LA, which usually we require them to go up there 2 days. And it's funny, I get this question a lot about what we can do to address the bias when it comes to a defendant, and certainly if restorative justice is an option that can help resolve the underlying issues that the defendants have, and that's something that we're open to. I found that the older someone gets and the more embedded the bias is, the harder it is to kind of use some of that programming to detangle the hate. But with younger offenders, it's particularly effective if you can catch it early.
I know we apply a lot of those things looking at the underlying trauma and everything, especially if we have minors. But like you said, I think with adults, each case is weighed on its own, and I think it's really important to make sure the participants realize that we are very, very respectful of victims' rights and Marcy's rights, which means that we do make sure that we engage victims and we get what is their perspective. What does healing and restoration look like for that victim? And it's very particular to each victim. For some victims, what looks like accountability is more traditional. And for some victims, what looks like accountability could be in the form of classes or restorative practices. We engage and invite victim perspective and we respect it. At the same time, if we think that a certain offender is going to pose a danger in the future that can't be mitigated by a class or by some kind of rehabilitative process, then like, for example, a shooting in a synagogue that results in death, just hypothetically speaking, because I don't want to discuss a specific case, then the crime might have gone too far to try to mitigate that way. And I don't want to forget here to thank also from Mayor Dedina's team or the city's team, Mayor Pro Tem Paloma Aguirre, Council Member Mark West, Council Member Ed Spriggs, who are joining us and have been engaged with us. And I also want to thank Lieutenant Juan Marquez from the IB Sheriff's Station, who is participating here with us. And from my own team, Yoli Apalategui, our Director of Community and Government Affairs, and Jim Kelly, who helped us prepare this program in partnership with IB.
So there looks like there's a question about drawings that depict law enforcement in a derogatory fashion, and whether or not that could be a hate crime. So careers in California actually are not a protected characteristic within California's hate crimes laws. So that any hate incidents that involve someone because of what they do for a living isn't one of those categories that's protected. But can that image still be potentially a crime? Sure, it depends on the circumstances. If you intend it to be a threat towards a specific officer and it causes that person to be in sustained fear, that could be a criminal threat. So it depends on the circumstances, but as far as hate crimes are concerned, in California at least, professions are not a protected characteristic. There are actually some states that do criminalize crimes against specific people, like Texas protects their judges under their hate crimes laws, which is interesting. I think West Virginia protects people who served in the military. There are some states that protect the homeless as a protected class, but in California, we're limited to those 5 categories that I talked about, plus association with any of the above. There is another question about why chalk isn't potentially a hate crime as opposed to paint. And the answer to that really is there is no distinction as far as classifying it as a hate incident. The mechanism that you use to show that you're biased doesn't make it any less a hate incident, whether you use chalk or paint. But where we potentially fall is, how do we fit that into a crime? Because remember, there has to be a crime that's committed, and then we have to prove additional elements to make it a hate crime. So if you use chalk, that's not a vandalism, but if you use paint, it is. So depending on what's written, if it's a threat to someone that you're going to cause death or great bodily injury that you write in chalk, that's good enough for a criminal threat. It doesn't matter. But if we're talking about just hate speech that's written down on a sidewalk, that distinction does matter because we have to still fit it within a crime. Hopefully that answers the question from Suzanne.
I think there was a good question about, you know, absent programs and education, don't we risk radicalizing people in prison? And the truth is that people are getting radicalized, not just in prison, but online because of all of the dark web sites. We've unfortunately had cases like that where people are getting radicalized. They feed hate and they encourage hate, and they make people who might be already having some issues kind of feel like they may be a martyr or get more respect through spewing hate or violence, actually. So these are issues that we have to face, and you know, there are no easy answers, but I would say that the more that we can do at a young age, you know, our kids don't grow up with hate. We kind of teach them hate. So what can we do from a young age, from a school system to community to families, to make sure that what we value is respect, and respect of human beings, respect of human dignity, aside from color or anything else that society wants, you know, to have stereotypes about. Do you see other questions? Let me see.
There's a question from an attendee: how is a hate symbol classified? You know, a lot of what prior investigators, and actually what the Anti-Defamation League does a lot, is identify hate symbols. Every year they update their database with the new versions of whatever hate symbols are kind of in fashion for that time period. It's hard to say how something actually is classified. There are obviously some obvious ones like the burning cross and the swastika that are deeply rooted in history that we can point to and say, but as far as the new ones, it just depends on how quickly it spreads and how pervasive its use is, and the manner in which it's used. If we start seeing something used repeatedly in conjunction with targeted hate crimes, then it may help speed up the fact of identifying something as a hate symbol. Some of the ones that have come out recently with Dylan Roof, who was the church shooter, the bowl cut became pretty popular. And so that actually became a symbol, a hate symbol. Recently, we've had the OK symbol also be something that's been classified as a symbol used by white supremacist groups. And so it just sort of depends on the circumstances and the manner and the frequency with which they're used and who it's associated with as far as how we classify something as a hate symbol.
Good questions from the group. Feel free, there's no question that's not a good question.
Summer and Leonard, I had received a question via email. If I could answer it, would you mind?
Great, please.
So I had made a very strong statement about rejecting the history and legacy of white supremacy and racist violence in Imperial Beach. And I think there was a robust discussion via social media questioning that history, some rejecting that assertion. And so I wanted to address that based on my own personal history and then even employment within the city of Imperial Beach going back over 30 years ago. And so I moved to Imperial Beach in 1971 from a multiracial community of Arroyo Seco in Los Angeles. I was 7 years old. I think my family, my parents who had dealt with Nazi violence in England, my mother was bombed by the Nazis. Her house was actually blown up. My dad's family, I actually have the deportation orders for my dad's cousins who were sent to concentration camps and murdered by the Nazis. And so the history of rejecting hate and racism in my family was very, very prevalent. It was a big theme in my life and my family life. So we were shocked when we moved to Imperial Beach and just heard the prevalence of racist language. And that, obviously that's free speech. People can be as racist as they want, but I think it was shocking for me as a 7-year-old, and then more importantly, shocking to my parents. What was more shocking though, I think to us, was to see the prevalence of open white supremacists. All you had to do was go to the foot of the Imperial Beach Pier and you were immersed in the world of the Aryan Brotherhood, biker gangs. It wasn't like anybody was hiding anything. You could see the swastikas very prominently, people who've been out of prison. The Aryan Brotherhood is a very prominent racist white supremacist gang, has strong roots in Imperial Beach. And people who were openly acknowledged as Nazis, not neo-Nazis, but who openly declared they were Nazis. How could you tell that? Because they were open about it and you could see their swastikas. I think having worked on the Imperial Beach Pier from 1981 to 1985 as a lifeguard, I saw that day in and day out. It was no longer shocking, it was normal to see that gang. And then later, and then see the numbers of incidents, for me, culminating in the 1980 racist attack by a member of the Aryan Brotherhood on a white man defending the right of a black man to be at a community cookout that we held. And so what was, I think, shocking to me at that time was it wasn't considered a big deal in San Diego. It barely made the newspaper. And I think that person only got 2.5 to 3 years of in prison for shooting somebody in the mouth for defending the right of a black man just to exist, using racist language during the attack. It was pretty eye-opening. I've really never gotten over it. I vividly have that, will never get rid of that crime and that image of that happening. My friend Chris and I were there, watched the whole thing, really heavy. No one even interviewed us, talked about it at all. Never talked about it. Wasn't a big issue in Imperial Beach at the time. Later in the 80s, and a lot of the kids who grew up with parents in the Aryan Brotherhood became skinheads, very well known in Imperial Beach. That culminated in 1999 and with the shooting by Roy Laxima of 2 skinheads who had been assaulting him. He was actually, I'm not sure convicted, but not put in prison. A lot of extenuating circumstances in that, but very well-known presence of skinhead gangs in Imperial Beach. Now, did they hide? No, absolutely not. They were very open about being skinheads. The symbols, Nazi symbols, swastikas, the white pride, white power, graffiti, you could see very commonly. Talk to anybody in the sheriff's department, the old timers, the old school sheriff deputies, and they're very familiar with that. folks who've been in the sheriff's department. That culminated also with a militia, a sub-off group of a militia group that was active in Imperial Beach. In addition to in the 1980s and late 1970s, groups of people from Imperial Beach who were assaulting and attacking undocumented workers who were crossing the border. That was something that was interrupted by a special task force put together by the San Diego PD that Joseph Wamba later wrote about in his book, Lines and Shadows. So this is not something that's secret. It was not anything that was unknown at the time. It was very well known. I think what's my concern was that we've tended to sort of minimize this. And there was, growing up in Imperial Beach, especially as a guy on the beach, especially as a lifeguard, what I saw was it's always the victim's fault. So if a guy came up to a couple and this happened and beat them with a skateboard for being black because they were black, well, it was their fault for being here at the pier. And most of those crimes weren't reported. Everybody knew about them. And when you start talking to folks from outside of Imperial Beach, our black neighbors and Hispanic neighbors from around the county, especially South County, National City, Chula Vista, it was very clear that they were afraid to be in Imperial Beach because of the prevalent racism and potential for racist attacks, especially later in the 90s with skinheads and early 2000s. We even had a riot, a skinhead riot and assault that took place during the Sun and Sea Festival. Maybe some residents will remember that occurred, I think, less than 20 years ago. So this is not a secret history. It's important to acknowledge it. And I'll be honest with you, when I saw the video of the attack, the cowardly attack on Marcus Boyd, that brought back a number of images to me of types of assaults that had happened at the pier, where it was a hotbed of racism and white supremacists. And so it was important for me to speak out and to acknowledge this past, but also to make sure that it doesn't continue. That IB's changed a lot, but there's still a group of folks that are very intolerant. When I was running in 2016, 2014, there was an anti-Semitic flyer that went out. And I know my dad was shocked, but we weren't surprised. We were shocked, but not surprised, because that's what we had lived in IB. And so it was just, oh, wow, it's this come back. These guys are still here. So as a city, and I know our city council completely rejects racism, hate crimes, hate incidents, and supports the district attorney and our sheriffs investigating and then prosecuting these cases and making sure that everybody in IB feels welcome and respected and tolerated, and that anybody who visits IB feels safe and protected as well. So I'll end there, but glad to discuss this offline as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Mayor, for that. And I think the bottom line is that sometimes you know, people have different perceptions, and sometimes depending which block we notice, you know, in terms of trends, what block you live on can affect how you feel about what is going on out there. And, you know, two perspectives can be right in terms of seeing a town, but your perspective has a long history. And I think the most important point that you make is to never be okay with it and normalize it at any level, no matter how small of a group it is. Hopefully it is a very small group at this point, but even a small group can, you know, a little bit of arsenic can really ruin the whole batch. So we can't normalize or tolerate any dose of poison. I see a few more questions, and Leonard, I think we could group them as questions about can crime, excessive force, or crime committed by police officers based on statistics that people of color are more the targets, can that be prosecuted as hate crime? And I think what, from my perspective, what I would say is everyone is accountable under the law. Anyone can be convicted of a hate crime, no matter what uniform or color or, you know, medical degree or anything that they have. But I think we can't use just statistics in general. Each case is its own case, and you have to be able to specifically have evidence in that particular case. So Leonard, maybe you can add to that.
Yeah, so hate crimes laws vary throughout the entire country, but kind of at the core of pretty much every state's hate crimes laws is that there has to be that evidence of bias. And so when we talk about statistics that apply to all law enforcement everywhere, they might show that there is a problem with bias amongst law enforcement, but when we go to charge, we don't charge a department. We charge a specific person, a specific officer. So that bias has to attach to that specific officer. And that's where we go back to that slide that I had that talked about statements that are made before, during, or after, social media, hate symbols or tattoos that that person might have. And so those are the things that we look at to say, in that particular instance, was bias and motivation for why that excessive force or why that crime was committed. And that's what we're really looking for when we look at potentially whether or not we can charge someone under hate crimes laws. I know in other cases throughout the country that is being looked at, but what the investigators are going to need in those cases is that evidence of bias.
Right, and then there's related questions about whether you can charge a whole department, and the answer I think lies again in whether you can prove a conspiracy or elements of a crime. There have been cases, we saw them in Los Angeles, where there is a group, there's a larger group that in the department that have been engaged in crimes and corruption. We charged recently a massive public corruption case involving the charter schools with $80 million loss to our kids and teachers. And that had tentacles everywhere, but everything relies on specific evidence that you can show the connections, the conspiracy, who benefited, what happened. Our system of justice requires that as to each situation, you weigh the evidence very carefully. But what people can do, as in hate crimes, we're always looking for ways to improve the laws, and Leonard and I have even discussed whether there's certain very established hate symbols that send fear and trauma, like a swastika, like a KKK sign, whether we can promote legislation to make those per se hateful as a crime. But we don't know in balance with the First Amendment whether something like that would work. The same with police departments. I'm pushing for more transparency in terms of evidence that the department might have of group bias, because as a district attorney, I would want to know those things as we look to charge cases under Brady versus Maryland. We have to make sure that we're telling the truth in the charging of cases, but how can we tell the truth if there's certain evidence we don't know about? How can we assess it? So I think we can always improve the law, but we can't everybody is entitled to the protection of having proof beyond a reasonable doubt, including police departments and police officers. I don't see any more questions, Mayor, and we're at time. Do you have any closing remarks?
Well, sure. First, I want to thank all of our participants for the robust discussion. I think it's really important to have this virtual town hall. I want to thank you, DA Stefan, and Deputy District Attorney Tren for your excellent presentations, the information, but more importantly, the great work that you do to make sure that these crimes are prosecuted, and more importantly, to educate our community about why this is an issue, and even doing things I think is really innovative on having these phone numbers and email addresses and sites where people can report this type of activity. I think that's really, really important. So again, I want to thank all our Sheriff's Department investigators and detectives who have been vociferously on it and working with your department to investigate these crimes. So again, on behalf of the city of Imperial Beach and all residents, I want to thank you for your great work and spending an hour with your time, your valuable time with us this evening. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Mayor, very much. And I want to make sure that no one on the line, their questions are ignored. There is a repeated question about whether the thin blue line in flags or in anything are considered a hate symbol. As far as I know, it has not been classified as such. Leonard is nodding his head. Like anything, though, in combination with some other threat or anything else, then it, things get, evidence is very specific. But as far as we know, and we have your information, we will send you if there's a correction to that answer. But we're very up to date usually on hate symbols, and that hasn't been assessed as such at this time. Is that right, Leonard?
That's correct.
Okay. So thank you so much. We will try to track these questions, and there's something we didn't answer, we'll try to answer it by email. Thank you, and thank you, Mayor. Thank you, Leonard. Thank you for letting us participate with the great city of Imperial Beach. We appreciate it.
Thank you so much. We appreciate it.